Welcome to Speaking Freely. Today we're discussing a topic that has dominated the news headlines for the better part of a year. It's Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. This is a sad situation, but at this point, is there anything really new left to say about a conflict that's begun to feel as familiar as the Iraq War did during the Bush years? Well, as it turns out, I think there is. And just like what we learned about the flimsy pretext that justified the US invasion of Iraq back in 2004, there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, as it turns out, my guest tonight is going to prove that the simple stories that have been fed to us by mainstream media at the moment about Russia's invasion might be missing large portions of the total story. Now, Professor Ivan Kachanovsky has studied the conflict from a unique insider vantage point. As a professor of conflict studies and human rights and political science at the University of Ottawa, he not only has a deep understanding of the roots of Russia's and Ukraine's fraught relationship, but as a Ukrainian himself, who's fluent both in Russian and Ukrainian, he maintains a uniquely privileged vantage point from which to observe this war. Now, it's well established that since the 1960s, all wars have been fought not only on the battlefield, but in the media spheres as well. A consequence of this reality has been that media spin, or bending the truth, has become a crucial tool for countries to use in maintaining the public impression that they're winning on the battlefield and defeating their opponents. Now, during wartime, some of this bending of the truth can be justified, and most would agree that credit for Ukraine's unexpected resilience in the war can be partly attributed to President Zelensky's Churchill-like skills at rallying his people and his troops through effective media messaging. But to truly understand the war, we have to go beyond the spin that's being presented by both sides. Well, fortunately for us, on the show today, we have someone who, in my opinion, understands this conflict better than almost anyone. And in his own way, he's also been a brilliant investigator and researcher that's normally done by journalists on the ground. I would encourage anyone to visit Professor Kachanovsky's amazing YouTube channel, where he's been deconstructing the wartime narratives presented by both sides, essentially in real time, as they were happening, and before they appeared in the news days, if not weeks later. It's really amazing, prescient stuff. In any event, even for avid followers of this conflict, the Ukrainian conflict, this show will reveal new insights and information. So when we come back, Professor Kachanovsky is going to help us peel away the layers of media spin from all sides and to help us arrive at a more accurate picture of what's really happening on the ground. So stay tuned and join us after the break.
Very much so, yeah. Very concerned.
Very much so. I think it has an effect not just on the area, but on entire world stability.
Yeah, I think everybody should be.
Of course.
Yes, I am.
I look at it every day. I look at the news every day. And yeah, I'm concerned about war.
Yes, quite concerned, actually. I just feel that, we're on the brink of something a lot bigger and, than just two countries going at it. And it scares me to think that somebody can just walk in and, figure they can take property or take whatever they want. Well, I would hope this day and age that cooler heads will prevail and we can do it through negotiation. But if it means getting the whole world involved, then that's what it should be, because this is a world thing right now as it is.
By negotiations.
I suspect it may have to be a combination of the two at this point.
It's hard to say. I don't think Putin is a rational person, so I don't know whether they can negotiate a peaceful end or not.
Negotiation. I somehow find it very difficult to believe that Putin will negotiate so by military.
It's hard to say. I would love it to be negotiation, but unfortunately, it seems that force and world opinion is the only thing that seems to matter to Putin.
I think it's going to be negotiation probably in the future. That's what I think.
Welcome back to Speaking Freely. We're joined now by our guest, Professor Ivan Kachanovsky. He's a professor of political science at the University of Ottawa. He's also a professor of conflict studies and human rights policy. Welcome, Ivan.
Yeah, thank you.
Ivan, thank you for joining us today. I think the topic we're talking about is something very close to home, literally. You are Ukrainian by birth. You lived through the Soviet era in the Ukraine. And you have this unique perspective because your ability to read and source material in both Ukrainian and Russian allows you to see primary sources that most of us in the West, even journalists and reporters on the ground, don't have. So I'm really excited to have you here today. And I'm going to start with the history, because I think if we don't know our history, this is a cliche, but I think it's true. If we don't know our history, we're always bound to make similar errors in the future. Without a historical understanding of present-day Ukraine, we might be falling into some very predictable traps of misunderstanding. So we're going to do two levels of history here. History of Ukraine itself, which you've written on, and also your own personal history, which I think would help the audience understand kind of where you're coming from. So on the historical aspect of the country, not your story, tell us a little bit about Ukraine and how you've often described it as more like Canada than many people think. What is the genesis of that attribution, and what can you inform the audience about with regards to Ukraine's history?
And this is a very important and crucial issue to understand modern politics. It's necessary to understand Ukrainian history, and this was a subject of my doctoral dissertation under the direction of Seymour Martin Lipset at George Mason University, which I later published as a book.
I should add that Ivan and I both worked on a book together with whom he mentioned, a very famous professor of political science and sociology, Professor Seymour Martin Lipset. My mentor was Professor Noah Meltz, the late Noah Meltz and the late Seymour Martin Lipset. It was through that interaction that we first met many, many years ago, 20 years ago or more. So just throwing that out there. Please continue.
Yes, and this is also important.
Yeah.
So, and if you look into history, Ukrainian history is divided between different historical legacies and empires. A large part of Western Ukraine, called Galicia and Bukovina and Transcarpathia, used to be part of Austro-Hungarian Empire until World War I, while the other part of Ukraine used to be part of the Russian Empire until World War I. And then Ukraine became briefly independent, but after World War I and until World War II, it was also divided between Poland in the west and Romania and Czechoslovakia, which controlled different regions in Western Ukraine, and the remainder of Ukraine or other regions of Ukraine became part of the Soviet Union. And Ukraine became independent in 1991. So this historical legacies and historical divisions have very significant effect on modern politics of Ukraine, and I did analysis of all elections, basically all public opinion polls on issues of support for pro-Western parties and policies and orientations, and pro-Russian parties and policies and orientations, and this was a very big divide. In addition to this,
these studies were done from 1990 onward.
Yes.
Okay.
In all elections until Maidan. So Maidan had a very significant change.
And this is for the audience. The Maidan event, which is also called the Maidan Massacre in 2014, is kind of the source of where we are today. But we're going to get to that later.
Yes.
Yeah.
And another reason why it has significant effect is in terms of language, and this is why Ukraine is similar to Canada, because of such historical legacies. Ukraine is split or divided between regions which are mostly Ukrainian-speaking in Western Ukraine and Central Ukraine, and Russian-speaking regions in East and South part of Ukraine.
I see. So this history, and you've given us a really good, quick version of it, puts us in the position where we are today, which is Ukraine has only been a real independent country with its current borders since 1991. So in many sense, a very new country, young country, despite this old history where it was shared between different powers. That's important. And then the second point you just made is the linguistic cleavage that's also regional, like Canada, a region that speaks mostly Russian and a region that speaks obviously mostly Ukrainian. And it's divided in this east-west. Fascinating. I want to shift gears a little bit now and talk about your own personal history, because I think it also adds a layer of interest and complexity and informs your understanding of present-day Ukraine as well. You grew up during the Soviet era, and you came of age in a time when you said in Ukraine, it was actually more Soviet than even inside of Russia. Can you just explain a little bit about that time and the kind of experiences you had during those years?
Yes, this is also related to politics, because my mother, she lived in 4 countries without moving to any other country on her own because of politics, because of divisions.
And when was she born?
She was born before World War II in Poland. Then Poland, and then after World War II, they were expelled from Poland forcefully, along with all other ethnic Ukrainians, to Ukraine, Soviet Ukraine. And I grew up in Western Ukraine, in the region of Volhynia, which is very close to Poland. And I studied in university in Kiev, in economics university, and this is what happened. I think I was interested then in politics, and I attended actually first anti-Soviet demonstration or post-democracy demonstration in 1998 in Kiev, in downtown Kiev.
So in 1988, there was the first official anti-Soviet demonstration.
And this was not official because this was attended just few dozen people. And people, and basically Soviet secret police, KGB agents undercover, they arrested one female protester who tried to unveil Ukrainian blue and yellow flag. And this was near Republican Stadium.
So this was banned. The blue and yellow current flag that we see draped over many Canadian cities now was banned under the Soviet times.
Yes.
And this one woman who, part of the protesting group, tried to unfurl it, was jailed?
She was arrested. She was taken away during this demonstration. And afterwards, I attended basically all other political demonstrations, which were about Chernobyl and language and so on.
Right.
And when I studied in university in 1990, I submitted my proposal, and this is why Ukraine was very different even from Russia at the time during Perestroika. I submitted my proposal to university department, and they told me they're going to expel me from university just for if I would write my paper.
What was the proposal? Why was it so inflammatory at the time?
Because I said that I'm going to write using Western scholars, Western economists, and Western sociologists like Max Weber. And I wrote it, and they said they had no problem that I would write in Ukrainian. They said you can write in Chinese.
Okay.
And but they had a big problem with writing in Western series. So I wrote anyway using a Western economic series, which I had to basically cut even a textbook, classical textbook published in 1922. I had literally to cut pages because nobody else opens this.
So you told me the story before. You found a book in the archives of the Kiev University Library. It was one of the most important books in the economic canon of Western economics by Alfred Marshall. And you were the first Ukrainian, probably in all of Ukraine, to have opened it, because the pages were still bound together.
Yes, and it was published in 1922, so you can imagine.
And when were you doing this research?
In 1990.
Wow. Okay, so this gets us almost then to this 1991 period when you tell us about Ukrainians' independence. So what happened in that intervening very important year, or those early 90s? Can you walk us through that period? Because you said you were part of a movement, a growing movement of Ukrainian independence, where protests were growing. As we saw, and maybe you saw too in the Ukraine, the wall fell in between East and West Germany. But it took longer for these other regions of the former Soviet Union to break away. Can you just walk us through that period?
Yes, and then there was also a big division because there was a referendum for preservation of the Soviet Union in March 1991. And most of Ukrainians supported preservation of the Soviet Union, with the exception of western part of Ukraine. But then a coup attempt happened in Moscow, and when Mikhail Gorbachev was arrested by hardliners within the Communist Party and security forces. and he actually was staying in Crimea in his dacha. And he was arrested, but because of opposition from Yeltsin and other people who opposed this coup attempt, it failed. And this led to total change of policies in Ukraine, and Ukraine voted for independence. So basically, hardline communists who had majority in the parliament, they started to support independence overnight. And this was big change.
I see.
Afterwards.
So this referendum that occurred in 1990 or 91 supported staying with the Soviet Union, with Russia, I should say. But then the coup attempt in Russia itself changed allegiances. And these hardline communists that had been saying no suddenly flipped and agreed to a Ukrainian independence movement.
Yes, exactly. And this is why they voted for independence on August 24th, 1991. And afterwards, in December of 1991, was a referendum for independence. And most people supported, including in Crimea and Donbass, supported Ukrainian independence because this was a total new reality. So that's why this was very important.
Okay. So we're going to walk through this history. What I'm doing with this in this segment, because we'll have time to speak afterwards as well, is to bring us to 2014, which people even now have forgotten, let alone events that happened 30 years ago that we're talking about now. But I think if you walk us through the progression of Ukrainian democracy, and I can use it in air quotes, right? Because this is something you've also been writing about in detail. What is democratic about present-day Ukraine? How democratic is it? How democratic is it on the eve of Russia's invasion and so on? But tell us what's happened over that period from 1991 now that Ukraine is independent to the events that 2014, but we're going to tackle those after. Just walk us through that period.
So after Ukraine became independent, it agreed to renounce its nuclear weapons, which were left from the Soviet Union. This was a result of negotiations between Russia and the United States and other countries, which basically said that they would provide
assistance?
Assistance in case of potential kind of security threat to Ukraine, but without giving any written guarantees. So this was not a written kind of guarantee. It was not like NATO article to defend Ukraine. And for this reason, but Ukrainian government decided to give up nuclear weapons, even so it could not control them. They were just remaining from the Soviet times. And
so all Ukrainian nuclear weapons, which were part of the old Soviet Empire, were taken away and removed from the Ukrainian borders.
Yes, and they were moved to Russia or destroyed as a part of assistance program with the United States. And then a major event happened in 2004 called Orange Revolution, when there was an attempt to falsify elections by then Prime Minister of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych. And this failed after opposition candidate, which was pro-Western candidate called Viktor Yushchenko, was poisoned with a very kind of unique case, and still not solved case of poisoning with dioxin. And this led to his victory because there was a sympathy for him. And after he became president, he accused his opposition members of his own, basically supporters, for poisoning himself. And this is, but there was no kind of discovery of this, who actually was responsible. But this is very interesting that he would accuse opposition, not anybody else.
Right. So the 2004 election, in which this more pro-Western candidate ends up winning, but based on this poisoning event, which has still not been truly resolved, the sympathy he gains, that's been the sort of tendency in Ukraine. Those elections, the periodic ones, is it every 4 years that an election cycle happens in Ukraine? We had back and forth. There would be a pro-Western leader, maybe a more pro-Russian leader, and then we get a leader that is decidedly pro-Russian, but is making overtures to the West. Is this correct? That there would, on the eve of 2014, there was a decision whether Ukraine would become closer aligned with the European Union or not, and a decision was made to say no to the European Union integration. And what happened? And maybe that's where we'll leave it before the break.
Oh yes, there was regional divisions, and which I also examined in my dissertation, which was published as a book, and this was major topic of my kind of research. And in 2010, Viktor Yanukovych, who was basically considered to be total kind of failure after his attempt to falsify elections in 2004, he got elected as president of Ukraine with absolute majority support in the East and south of Ukraine, which
Okay.
are pro-Russian regions. And he promised to make Russian language a second state language and to have better relations with Russia. And this is why this has led to his overthrow in 2014, which was, again, turning point for Ukraine. And he also, but when he actually became president, he tried to sign an association agreement with the European Union.
Right.
And he promised that this would be beneficial, and a lot of people believe him. Because this was considered by many Ukrainians possibility to join the European Union. So this is like a communism, but in a kind of different way. So they believe that there will be paradise if Ukraine would sign association agreement with the European Union. Even so, this was not any membership. And even the European Union specifically told Yanukovych and Ukrainian government that there will be no prospect of even Ukraine joining the European Union. But in my research, I wrote op-eds saying that Ukraine, or the only chance for Ukraine to become like Canada, basically, or Western democracies, is to become a part of the European Union. And this was more than 20 years ago.
Right.
But
so that attempt, we're going to end there, but we'll come back to it, of Ukraine on the precipice of kind of going closer with Russia, having this bilingual state, but then also closer with with the European Union. Hopefully an ideal marriage of the two tendencies of East and West. But as we know, that didn't happen. That tension pulled apart. And when we come back after the break, we'll find out what happened in that eventful year of 2014 and why it really sows the seeds of what we're experiencing now. So join us after the break. Welcome back to Speaking Freely. We're here with Professor Kachanovsky talking about the Ukrainian conflict, but we spent the first half of our discussion talking about the origins, the deep origins of and historical roots of the current conflict. And we're right on the eve of 2014, an event that we in the West have been calling the Maidan Massacre, but in point of fact, it's Maidan. So we were talking about Ukraine's potential deal with the EU and the West, and at the same time, easing concerns from Russia that the Ukraine was drifting too far into Western hands and preserving things like the Russian language. That this deal that Yanukovych, who was the president at the time of the Ukraine, would have had an ability to, what they call we say that a phrase is squaring the circle, having your cake and eating it too. What happened to make that potential deal that eased the East-West tensions in Ukraine fall apart?
And initially, when this European Union Association Agreement and Free Trade Agreement was supported by Yanukovych, so a lot of people believe this would be like a communism for Ukraine. It would bring economic prosperity, and because Western Europe is very rich and so on, so everybody believes this would be a very good deal.
It would bring investment in, it would bring social supports in a way that communism used to.
Yes.
So it was support, okay.
And a lot of people actually believe that this would also mean European Union membership, even so there was not such a possibility in agreement. And actually, when Yanukovych or his government officials read this agreement, which was very long and almost 1,000 pages long, so they found that this actually agreement would have a negative effect on the Ukrainian industry, like heavy industry, which was concentrated in the east and the south of Ukraine, which are main areas of support for Yanukovych. And also, European Union demanded that if Ukraine would sign such agreement, so they have to basically cut
subsidies,
and relations, economic relations, and foreign trade with Russia to basically kind of to have tariffs and so on to make trade with Russia kind of more difficult and more expensive. And Russia at the time was main trading partner for Ukraine. And this has led to kind of to events which become a turning point for Ukrainian history and politics.
So this 2014 event, where the deal is read more closely by Yanukovych and his officials, realizes that it would have a negative effect on the main industries of Ukraine at the time, which were trading with Russia, that this would actually be untenable for him politically, because he would lose all his support. Okay, so he breaks the deal. Tell us what happens next.
And then mass demonstrations against Yanukovych started and in support of European Union membership. And I was watching this live. And this started actually on November 30th, at the end of November. And
2013?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I was watching this live, and then this was presented during live. In Ukraine, this was like 4 a.m. in the morning. And I was watching this live, and police started basically to violently beat pro-Western, pro-European Union demonstrators in Maidan, in the Maidan main square of Ukraine, in Kyiv. And this was presented as basically Ukrainian police beating students on national television, and specifically channel which was supported by Yanukovych, head of presidential administration.
Wow.
But this was not accidental, because when I did my research afterwards about this event, there was already presence of a far-right group which was called Right Sector during Maidan, and they started to basically clashes with police before, started using violence against police, and this was not shown on any media. And this has led to much bigger actions of protest against Yanukovych, which then became violent and ended with Maidan massacre.
Okay, so now this is very part of your own research. So in 2014, this is what I remember, and I didn't realize the protests had started already in 2013. But 2014, to remind our viewers, Russia is celebrating the Winter Olympics. It's a big event for Russia. This is February 2014. The spotlight is on Russia. They've invested billions of dollars in a region in Sochi, invited the world to see the new Russia. And yet this is happening on their border. And it's very disruptive, both to Russia's geopolitical interests in the region, but also it falls literally during the events of that 2-week Olympic campaign that the most violent parts of this uprising occur in Maidan, which is a square in Kiev. And from your own research, the people involved in that are not whom we think at least has been presented as being the story. And to bring it even to more current times, we're taping this at the end of 2022. There was a trial that was going on in Kiev, like right now, literally live streamed, which apparently no one was watching. Yes. You were watching. Tell us what that trial revealed that's just ending in late 2022. And what do we know what happened in that 2014 event in Maidan?
This is my main area of research. Right. Now, Maidan massacre, which started all the conflicts and now including escalation after Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And based on my research, including, so I examined all the videos from this Maidan massacre, which were like thousands of videos. I examined radio intercepts. I watched entire Maidan massacre trial. I think one of the few people, and maybe one person in the entire world, which...
you tweeted out there was one viewer, and that was you, right? Because this was being live streamed,
Yeah, and this is quite unique because this Maidan massacre trial and a lot of other evidence, like hundreds of testimonies, which are publicly available of witnesses, they testified, including majority of wounded Maidan protesters. They testified at the Maidan trial, Maidan massacre trial, that they were wounded, and they saw snipers, not in the locations of government forces, but in the buildings which were controlled by opposition, by Maidan opposition. And they were shot by snipers from these locations. And this is testimonies of absolute majority of wounded protesters, Maidan protesters. In addition to this, there was testimonies of several dozen prosecution witnesses. They were supposed to testify that police on the ground shot Maidan protesters, but they testified that actually they saw snipers in the same locations, which were controlled by Maidan opposition, and that when government snipers arrived, after police were shot and protesters were killed, so this massacre almost stopped.
I see.
So that's why this was a crucial event. In addition to this, there was evidence like forensic examinations by government medical and experts, and a lot of videos which were not shown by the media, which show how this massacre developed, and there are videos of the snipers from Maidan side, from Maidan opposition, including a group which was linked to far-right.
Right. These are the far-right groups that have been talked about in the Western media, actually, until recently. The Azov battalion and these folks that are far-right, nationalists, and have links, I would think, with some even fascist elements, right? That's the story. Okay, so this is very interesting. So the massacre itself seems to have been accelerated, or the most violent aspects came from this far-right group, misattributed to the police. But then that event, though, is a catalyst for what? What happened next?
No, this was, in addition to far right, there was also elements like there were public admissions by several Georgian ex-military members who testified in various documentaries, Italian documentary, Macedonian television, and Israeli documentary, and American documentaries. That they were also part of Maidan sniper groups. There were several Maidan sniper
There were
groups.
several groups, not just this one.
Yes.
Okay.
Including, but they basically were from Maidan side.
Okay.
And later this led to overthrow of Yanukovych government because he was blamed for this massacre. Even so, there is no evidence of what at all.
Right.
No evidence. And the Maidan massacre trial just confuses.
Yeah. So he's deposed, and the governments that have taken over, successive governments, ending with the current government of Zelensky, have been much more pro-Western, pro-European than pro-Russian. This is fair to say?
Yes. Yes. And after Maidan massacre and overthrow of Yanukovych government, and he fled from Ukraine, not because of he was responsible for the massacre, because there were also assassination attempts against him. And he fled to Russia, and pro-Western government came to power. But after this, pro-Russian region of Crimea was annexed by Russia.
What year was that? Remind us again.
2014.
Oh, okay.
In the spring of 2014, right after the massacre. And then there was a separatist rebellion in Donbass, in the eastern region, which is also was pro-Russian region.
So I want to get to this part. This is going to get us to the current conflict and Russia's invasion, but which you've decried, by the way. You've been very emphatic on that. But tell our viewers about how this particular conflict, especially in the Far East, has more the elements of a civil war, perhaps, than the West is knowledgeable about. Can you explain that for us?
Yes, and this is also a crucial event because I wrote about this in my dissertation, which was published even before, and in my papers and articles, which was published before the Maidan events. And I predicted there will be a possibility of such civil war, similar to what happened in Moldova or what happened in former Yugoslavia.
Right.
And this is what happened in Donbass, because Donbass was a region which had ethnically Russian population. Okay. Almost half of the population was ethnically Russian, and Crimea was a majority ethnic Russian population.
Okay.
So in Donbass there was support for separatists, and then after Maidan massacre, after Yanukovych fled, he was originally from Donbass.
Oh.
There was a pro-Russian separatist movement which took control basically of this large parts of these two regions in Donbass. And later, this became civil war because this was kind of, according to majority of scholars who research this conflict, it's classified as civil war. But there were also Russian military interventions in support of separatists in August of 2014 and in February of 2015.
Right.
But majority of casualties and majority of people who participated in this war, and I researched this very closely, were local Ukrainians, basically.
Right. So Ukrainians are fighting and dying on both sides.
Yes.
And this Donbass region has been in this conflict since 2014.
Yes.
That's 8 years.
Yes.
Okay. And Russia's been supporting these groups. There's no denying that. Bring us to then February 2022. Why does Russia invade? What's the idea? You yourself have decried and come out against this invasion, but what was their impetus? What were they thinking?
And I actually wrote about this also on Canadian television, CTV News. I gave interviews before Russian invasion. I said this would be a real possibility. This is a real danger that Russia would invade Ukraine. But I did not. I said that Russia would not try to occupy entire Ukraine, but they would just try to seize eastern and southern regions of Ukraine. And this is what happened in 2014. I'm sorry, in 2022 in February, Russia invaded Ukraine. And they used, they said basically that the reasons for invasions were Donbass. Kind of, they said there was a genocide of Russian-speaking population in Donbass. Even so, my research shows this is not a genocide. This cannot be classified as genocide. But there was significant civilian casualties in Donbass. In addition to this, so Russia basically inflated this claim. And Russia also claims that Ukraine is a Nazi state or semi-Nazi state with Nazis in power. And again, this was highly inflated and not based on actual evidence. And I researched far-right very closely. And far-right in Ukraine is very strong, very influential because their reliance on violence and because their participation in overthrow of Ukrainian government in 2014. But this is not, there is no Nazi state and no Nazi government in Ukraine. So, and Russia also stated that Ukraine would join NATO, and this is danger for Ukraine. there was no real possibility of Ukraine becoming NATO member in the foreseeable future, but there was a danger that Western countries used Ukraine basically as a plus down against Russia.
Right.
And Russia basically inflated this threat as well, and they invaded Ukraine under such pretexts.
And this is where your insights are so interesting, because you gleaned all of that by reading the Russian press and knowing what was coming. This is how Russia was beating the drumbeat for their invasion, these fears, escalating these fears. But what's also true, and what the West often now wants to deny, are these elements within Ukraine that are problematic, both for Ukraine itself, for its future as a democratic state, these neo-Nazi groups, and for the future of a peace deal. So in this last minute we have, can you just outline what would be your desire if you could wave a wand? How would this conflict get resolved? What do you think? Maybe I'll ask a more pragmatic question. How do you really think this situation will resolve itself? Not what you ideally wish, but what do you think will happen?
I think that at the end, there will be a peaceful agreement. This is most likely outcome. And Russia would not occupy entire Ukraine. This was not their goal, but they would try to keep as much of eastern and southern Ukraine as they would manage to occupy. They already annexed part of these regions. And Ukraine would not be able to take Crimea and Donbass back by military force because Russia has advantage. So this means there is only a way to kind of resolve this, and I think this is a real possibility that will be peace deal or compromise. But it will be very tough, and there is no kind of, I don't see this might be soon, this war can last for a very long time, because there is no kind of desire from Ukrainian government and specifically from Western governments to reach such deal. And basically, this would mean that they would admit that Russia would have a gains, would achieve significant gains in Ukraine.
And that's the problem, isn't it? That if a deal is struck to eliminate the war, we in some sense sanction Russia's invasion and this eastern part falling under their more closer influence. So that's a problem, but you know, I think we should all strive and hope for a diplomatic solution sooner than later, because as you've said many times, the people that are dying on the front lines are Ukrainians on both sides of this conflict, most of them. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Professor Kachanovsky. I very much appreciated your discussions today. I think you've opened many people's eyes to the contemporary history of Ukraine, but also its older history, which bears upon what's happening today. So thank you once again.
Thank you.
So join us quickly after the break.
I really don't know how much Canada is doing. I don't have much confidence at all in our Prime Minister, so that really says it all too. I don't think peace negotiators are going to do a huge amount at this point. So I think what Ukraine, you have to listen to the president. What's best for them, he'll let Canada and the rest of the countries know.
I think we're doing a pretty good job, but I think we could provide more military aid and more financial support.
More would always be better, but they are taking a respectable role on the world scene, in my opinion.
To be honest, I'm not aware of what Canada is doing to resolve the conflict in the Ukraine. I'm not aware of any, for example, overtures that Trudeau has extended to try to talk to Putin or convince him to pull out. And I know that we are offering military aid financially, but I'm not aware of anything else. If it sends weapons and troops, then this becomes something that can become much more dangerous, because it will involve NATO and participation directly, and then that could turn us into the next Third World War. So I think it does require some negotiations and probably some more sanctions. I think that eventually the Russian society will get tired of the crippling financial effects of these sanctions, and hopefully there's always a hope that they may overthrow the Russian government. This reminds me of the encroach of the Nazis taking over Sudetenland and other parts of the world, annexing it. I don't think this is the end of Putin's imperialism. I think that he will go on to try to flex his muscle and do other things in other parts of the world. And I think that we need to stop the encroach at the early stages before it becomes more broad and has the potential to turn into a third world war.
Personally, I have a very difficult time in believing that peace negotiations will work, because Putin didn't invade the Ukraine in order to negotiate a peace treaty later on. He wants what he wants. I don't know how much any country can do personally, you know, unless you attack the troop placements in Ukraine. You can send unless you actually attack, which isn't going to happen. It should, but it won't. Then I mean, you can send as much military equipment as you have, but eventually it's up to the Ukrainian troops, and against Russia, it's difficult. But I definitely support Ukraine. I mean, like 100%.
Canada just tries to, you know, do enough to be diplomatic, and that's about it. But to answer your question, no, I think, you know, as a big country like us, we can probably do more to, you know, to resolve the conflict. I'd say peace negotiating. That's what I hope it would come to and resolve this. So I would like to see Canada send more peace troops like they used to do back in the days of when Cyprus, you know, we had a lot of peacekeepers in Cyprus at the time, and all over the world. You know, Canada usually sends a lot of peacekeepers, and I think we should send more.
I don't know too much about it. I haven't looked into it. I know they do send money over there, but I'm not sure what they're doing to negotiate the war. So peace is always the best for me. That's what I would think. Sending troops and arms is just gonna kill more people.
I hope it's resolved sooner rather than later for everyone's benefit.
More peace negotiations. I wish it would be resolved soon. I think it's very hard on both sides, particularly the Ukrainians. What I'm reading in the press, what I'm seeing on television, it's very difficult to watch. The lives of people who have, you know, suffered a lot. I'd like to see that end soon. So.
The only issue I want is Russia leaving Ukraine. That's the important issue.
Welcome back. I'm hopeful that our conversation with the professor has shone a light on a subject, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that many of us have either tuned out or thought we already understood. But as the conflict now enters its one-year mark, most experts would now agree that even if the war ends, the crisis in the Ukraine and the deeper aspects of this conflict are not going away anytime soon. So rather than lose interest or simply accept conventional narratives applied to this conflict, I would encourage all those who watched and listened to the program to consider digging a little deeper to seek the truth. To paraphrase a well-known aphorism, the truth will always set one free, and in this case, free from misattributions and false narratives that are often used by powerful interests to shield themselves from the true purposes of their actions and policies. Now, Professor Kachanovsky, as we saw, grew up in the Soviet era in Ukraine. This personal history and his ability to both read and understand Ukrainian and Russian sources of information, along with those produced by Western powers, gave him a unique ability to unpack all this fog of war complexity. We learned in this episode of the circuitous route that Ukraine used to achieve its independence in 1991. Before this, Ukraine had been part of the Soviet Union, and before that, it had been carved up by the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Imperial Russia. As a result, part of Ukraine, this eastern part that encompasses the Donbass region and Crimea, has always been closer to Russia and has had a large number of ethnic Russians and Russian speakers. While the western parts like Galicia, have been Ukrainian-speaking and more strongly associated with Europe and the West. This has just been a historical fact. These historical, linguistic, and ethnic cleavages should therefore complicate our understanding of the present-day war in the Ukraine. There has been a separatist movement that has been most assuredly supported by arms and financing by Russia since 2014. But that separatist movement has never really gone away. And the majority of the people who are dying on both sides of that conflict are sadly Ukrainians. As a proxy war then between the West and Russia, this story needs to be told. So, Russia's invasion in February 2022 sits within this more murky historical backdrop, along with the events of the 2014 Maidan Square massacre, which has been played up in Russian media as a neo-Nazi coup d'etat over a Russian-friendly government. And the presence of these neo-Nazi battalions in the Ukrainian conflict has been played up in an exaggerated manner in Russia to justify their invasion. But we shouldn't forget that that presence has also been assuredly played down by Western governments to justify our support for the war. An end of this conflict will surely come, and in the end, it will have to be a diplomatic solution. And the sooner this realization permeates both sides of the conflict, the better for the Ukrainian population and for the rest of the world. So thank you once again for joining us today. And as always, I encourage you to stay curious and be compassionate.